And as always, if you can mark the song after the lesson for this morning, page 146. That will be the song after the lesson this morning. We are in Job chapter 14, and it was read into your hearing, verse number 1, Job chapter 14. Additionally, I'm going to read to you verses 1 through 5 in Job 14, as it reads. Man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. Like a flower, he comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. You also open your eyes on him and bring him into judgment with yourself. Who can make the clean out of the unclean? No one. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you, and his limits you have set so that he cannot pass. The lesson that I want to impress upon your minds this morning is simply follow the example of Job. Job as the example. It can be hard to follow the example of Job when we look here in chapter 14. As Job is talking in chapter 14, he is talking from a point of lowliness. Job is very low as he has gone through many things at this point. And he talks about death. He talks about life. He talks about why me. He brings all of these things up. So when you look at Job in chapter 14, it can be hard to say, I want to follow his example. But Job is known as a righteous man. Job is one who hated evil. As Job chapter 1 opens up, God points to Job and he tells Satan, have you considered my servant Job as you were going to and from in the earth, seeking whom you may devour? God looked favorably on Job. God knew that Job was one who was able to withstand all the tests of the devil that the devil would bring Job's way. And so when we look at Job, we should think highly of Job as one who was considered by God himself to be tried by the devil. And so the devil is tried Job as God has given the devil permission to. And Job goes through all of these circumstances. He loses his children. He loses his family. He loses all of his material possessions. And in this, Job did not curse God at all. Job was one who understood that the Lord gave, and even though the Lord allowed it to be taken away, Job said, I'm still going to worship God. The devil comes back to God, tells God that if you allow me to touch his flesh, I guarantee you that Job will curse you to your face. God tells the devil, you can touch his flesh, but you're not able to kill Job. And so Job now goes through physical ailments. He is covered from head to toe in boils. He's covered with all of these sores within his body. And it's gotten so bad to the point, I believe it says in Job chapter 30, that there were worms that were crawling in these open sores that Job had. Job is dealing with all types of physical pain and torture, going through all of these physical ailments. And Job now talks. And he says, man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. One thing that we have to understand about this life is that man in his journey in this life is only a few days. You see, we can look at this life as we have all of this time. We have 20, 40, 50, 60, 70 years to get things right. But understand, in the scheme of things, man's existence on this earth is only but a vapor. It's a few days. James would say that life is like a vapor. Peter would say that the grass withers, the flower fadeth, such is to be compared to the human life. But the word of God lasts forever. So when we look at this life, we have to understand that this life is only but a few days. Not only is it but a few days, but also it's full of trouble. You see, as we live this life, we have to understand that regardless of our position in this life, we're going to experience some trouble. There's some people who feel like money is the cure to all things. If I just have enough money, I'll be well off. I can be able to buy my way out of sickness. I'll be able to afford a nice living. I can travel the world. There'll be no more problems. All of my problems will be fixed. I've got money. Failing to realize Job himself was a wealthy man. You see, money does not prevent sickness from coming. Money does not prevent a crazed shooter coming into a crowd to shoot up people. Money does not prevent a car accident that can take your life. Money does not prevent your loved ones from falling ill or somebody trying to take their lives. You see, whether you have money or whether you are poor, all life has problems. I can have all the money in the world and I'm still going to have problems because of sin in this life. And so Job, one who has had money, one who has had wealth, had a big family, all of it was taken away from him. A wealthy man whose days were full of trouble. So we need not look at the wealthy and say that they're better off because they have their own problems, just like we have our own problems. The poor man has his problems just as the wealthy has his problems. Everybody in this life is going to have problems. This life is a few days and full of trouble. And as we look at this life being few days and full of trouble, one thing we have to understand as well, that if this life is a few days and full of trouble, what does that let us know about our position with God in this life? Verse number 2, it says, like a flower he comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. You know, the process of life, as Job compares it to the flower here, when the flower first grows, it blooms and it blossoms and it gets to its peak point of where it looks vibrant and lively. Same with the human life. We are born, we are young, and then we get to this peak point to where we are vibrant and strong. And then, as we continue to live, we start to fade away. We become feeble. We become weak. And then we lay this life down. And so with that in mind, we have to understand that when I am dealing with this life, I'm going to lay this life down. Keeping in mind this, that I am closer to the grave today than I was yesterday. Each day that I live, I'm closer to the grave now than the day before. And see, Job is one who is facing the realization of this. He's going through all of these problems. He's gotten to the point where his wife tells him, curse God and die. Job begins to question, rhetorical questions that is. When man dies, is he going to live again? Job wishes that God would just cover him until this time passes by. It gets to the point where Job, as he's going through all of these trials in his life, will say, why pick on me? Why are you picking on me? Oftentimes we can go through a lot of things in this life and we can feel like God is picking on us. We go through all of these turmoils and these depressions and all of these trials in this life, and we feel like, why is God allowing this to happen in my life? Why pick on me? Forgetting to realize that all things work together according to good for good to those who love God. God is using the things in your life for the betterment of your life. And see, Job, as he's going through all of these things, he doesn't realize why God is allowing these things to happen in his life. Too many times we get caught up in the why. Why are you allowing this to happen? And we fail to keep our eyes on God. Too many times we can make the problem that is in our lives bigger than God, because we're going through all of these trials and it's very real. You know, we deal with all of these pains and we just want the pain to end. I'm tired of going through this. I'm tired of not having any money. I'm tired of not being able to pay my bills. I'm tired of barely having food to eat. I'm tired of the sickness that I have to face in my life. I'm tired of being in pain. I'm tired of dealing with loved ones who hurt me. I'm tired of all of these things in this life. You just wanted to go away, but you focus so much on the problem, and we fail to realize the one who is bigger than the problem, who is able to defeat the problem. And just like Job here, Job had all of these problems and is chronicled in 38 chapters until God finally talks with Job. You can go through all of these problems for an extended period of time, but it does not mean that God is not watching. God had his eyes specifically on Job because he allows Satan to try Job. Just because you are going through all of these problems in this life does not mean that God is not intently watching you. I believe it was the psalmist David who said, I was once young, now I'm old. Not once have I seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. The Hebrews writer tells us that Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, that God will be with us always. Jesus said himself, I am with you to the end of the world. Just because we experience pain in this life does not mean that God does not care. He cares, he watches over his children, and he is looking intently as we go through all of these things. No different than what Job is dealing with here. Job is going through all of these things that God allowed Satan to do. God tells Satan that you can touch his body. In other words, you can bring about all of this sickness on his body, but you can't take his life. God is watching Job. He's watching Job, and he's watching him intently. And Job, as he's going through all of these things, he's got a range of emotions going on. He's got all of these questions that are going through his mind. A man lays down his life. Is he to live again? A man breathes his last breath. Then what? Man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. See, when we go through certain things in this life, it has a way of bringing us to a humble point to where we begin to realize what the meaning of life really is. And here we see Job understanding this with regards to life. He's brought to a point of lowliness. He begins to ponder and say all of these things because he's understanding the meaning of life. But as we look at the example of Job, I want us to see something that Job specifically does in chapter number 14. Now we can easily just read this chapter and see that Job is making all of, or saying all of these questions, or has all of these questions, and that he is pondering all of these things. But Job does something specifically here. And this is what we need to do as well. And this is what suffering is good for as well. We look at suffering in this life. We look at how man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. We know that we're going to lay this life down. So while the blood is still running warm in our veins, we need to do exactly what Job does here. What does Job do? Job seeks God. Let's look at it. Let's read verses 6 through 9. Turn your gaze from him, that he may rest until he fulfills his day like a hired man. For there is hope for a tree when it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and its shoots will not fail. Though its roots grow old in the ground and its stump dies in the dry soil, at the scent of water it will flourish and put forth sprigs like a plant. But what Job says here in verse number, bear with me as I find it, verse number 15, he says, "You will call and I will answer. You will long for the work of your hands. For now you number my steps. You do not observe my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and you wrap up my iniquity." Job, out of all of this, seeks God. He desires for God to extend his protection over his life as he's going through all of these pains, all of these torments and trials that Job is facing. He never once stopped seeking God. One thing we need to realize: when we are going through the trials of this life, we cannot do it by ourselves. Too many times we can try to take the lead and take the charge and fail to lean on the strength of God. Too many times we can panic, if you will, and want to take matters into our own hands instead of seeking God in the matter. Out of all the trouble that Job went through, Job continued to seek God. Job continues to ask God for help. As a matter of fact, in the next chapter, Job will say to God, "Though you slay me, I will still worship you." Though God is allowing all these things to happen to Job, Job says, "I'm still going to worship God." We talk about this life being a few days and full of trouble, all of the suffering that we go through, the ups and the downs, the pains that we have to deal with. You see, sometimes we even struggle with ourselves. And we fail to realize that we need to be seeking God in the midst of all of this. We need to be leaning on his everlasting arms. You see, even when it looks like death is knocking at the door, and it looked like this for Job. Job's wife told him, "Curse God and die." It looked like death was knocking at the door for Job, and Job still leaned on God. Regardless of what we go through in this life, we need to be able to lean on God. You see, when you look at suffering in this life, as we realize that the days are short, life is but a vapor, we can be here today and gone tomorrow. We have to realize that there is a bigger meaning than this life. And that meaning you see Job taking advantage of here. He's asking God for his protection. He tells God, "Though you slay me, yet will I worship you." Job understands that God is bigger than this life and that man must lay this life down, but in the end, we are going to be held accountable to God. As a matter of fact, Solomon once said in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 12 through 14 there, this is the whole conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, because this is the whole of man. And see, you don't see anything different with Job. Solomon talks about vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Solomon had wealth, he had money, he had women. But he also knew that all of these things were material and that man is going to lay this life down. And then what? Job, who was a wealthy man, goes through all of these things. And he realizes as he's brought to a humble point in his life, death knocking at the door, I need God. Fear God, keep his commandments. Because God is going to bring into judgment all that we do. All the things that are done in secret, God is going to bring to light in the judgment. Jesus Christ says, "This is the love of God. If you love me, keep my commandments." And Jesus says, John chapter 12 and verse 48, "My words will judge you in the last day." Even though I have to go through turmoil in this life, I need to be able to rely on God. You see, I can have diseases in this life that there are no cure for. I will not focus on that disease. I focus on the one who is able to help me along while I have the disease. Paul himself, one who had a thorn in the flesh, stake in the flesh, by the way, I like to say, because that's what the word actually says. It was a big problem in Paul's life on a daily basis. Paul sought Jesus 3 times in prayer to remove this thing out of his flesh. Jesus tells Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." Paul says, "I will rejoice in everything that I have to go through. Whether this thorn in the flesh, these trials, persecutions, despairs, because where I'm weak, Christ is strong." We see here with Job, though he's at a low point, and he's literally in pain at the moment of the writing of these words, he leans on God. Are you leaning on God this morning? As we deal with all these things in our lives, we deal with sickness, we deal with pain, we deal with financial woes, highs and lows. We deal with people in our lives that cause us grief. But are you giving it to God? Are you doing what Job is doing here? Seeking God through the midst of it all. If not, this is what needs to be done. Because we see as well with Job, he never sinned. Throughout all of this, Job never sinned. God begins to question Job. Job has no answer, and he understands that he had no right to question God, but to rely on God. But God blesses Job at the end. He gives him everything that he had and lost. He gives it right back to him. God will bless you if you obey his word. Lean on God, just as Job did. Consider these things while we sing the song that has been selected, page 146. Page 146, we'll sing the first and the third verse of Have Thine Own Way. The first and the third verse, Have Thine Own Way. All ready? Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make